Okay, we'll get started. Hi there and welcome to the webinar. Today, we're going to combine the results from our 30,000 plus person survey of transit riders across North America. Our goal is at the end, you end up more informed on how transit riders are handling the recovery process from the pandemic and what to expect over the coming months. But before we start, I want to recognize our friends at VTA who lost 9 people in a horrible shooting this week. We'll take a moment of silence to remember their lives and keep everyone at VTA in our thoughts. Thanks. Well, here we are coming to you live on a beautiful Thursday afternoon here in Montreal and in Boston. I'm Emily Gates from the partnerships team here at Transit, and I'm focused on large US-based agencies. I'm joined by David, our Chief Business Officer at Transit, the former CTO of the MBTA and lover of afternoon strolls. We're keeping him indoors today, unfortunately, so hope he can put on a brave face for you all. I'm also joined by Kai, our fellow teammate in partnerships for mid-sized cities, and who just off camera is sitting in his own personal box fort as he is moving this weekend. Kai, I hope your souvenir shot glass collection is well bubble wrapped by now. On to what we're doing here today. Firstly, what is this program? Transit launched a subscription service for agencies to receive detailed local survey results on key customer satisfaction indicators on a quarterly basis. We're launching this new initiative, our Rider Happiness Benchmarking, mouthful, RHB for short, program to help public transit agencies both benchmark for interagency comparison and amass longitudinal data to track their own performance over time. We did a test run in November, and this report is our first official RHB survey. By distributing surveys in-app to our representative sample of riders spanning hundreds of agencies across North America, our program offers 4 survey reports per year for an annual subscription. While only subscribers will have access to all local agency-specific data, we'll continue to publish top-line national results publicly. The next RHB survey will be released through Transit in late July. We got help along the way. We solicited advice and input from RHB partner agencies and formed a steering committee for the types of questions to ask riders regularly that may help them inform decisions within their organizations. If you'd like to participate in the steering committee for our next survey, please get in touch with us and we'll tell you more about the opportunity to get involved with RHB. Now onto the agenda, we're going to go through high-level results real quick and look at demographics, how riders are returning to transit, how they rank agencies on various specific metrics of satisfaction, and what riders say would make them ride more. We've gotten a ton of written materials, which we'll follow up with after the webinar if you haven't received those reports already, as well as sending out a video of the next half hour or so to everyone as a follow-up. So you don't need a screenshot unless you want a tiny picture of our faces next to the images. Throughout, we hope that you will ask questions. If you are using Zoom, which all of you are, you should check out the bottom. There's a Q&A function. That is where we will be collecting Q&As from you all, or Qs from you all and As from us. If we've timed this well, this first section should take about 20 minutes, leaving plenty of time for questions. I'll turn it over to Kai to kick us off with survey results.
Thank you, Emily. So I'd like to start by taking a look at the data we got from the last 10 questions on the RHB survey itself. And those questions ask riders questions about demographic topics like occupation, income, racial and ethnic self-identification, gender identity, and more. We also asked about their vaccination status. So although those questions were marked as optional in the survey for our respondents, we're happy to report that 93% of respondents overall took the time to fill out that section. So to first take a look at the overall picture, we saw a 50% increase in responses compared to the November survey. So that means that 64 separate agencies past the local response rate necessary for statistical significance. Those agencies are spread out among some 7 Canadian provinces and 28 US states. Also, the survey is trilingual, so that means it appears in whatever language the user has set for their phone. And therefore, we've got thousands of responses from French and Spanish speakers, as well as English speakers. So let's also take a look at age. I think it's interesting on this slide to see how the longitudinal ridership trends change direction as you move from the youngest to the oldest age categories that we see on this chart. So one takeaway initially is that we're really seeing the effect of school closures here. In October, we'll run the fall RHP to take stock of what we're hoping will be a September ridership jump like no other. In terms of accessibility, 33% of our Canadian respondents and 39% of US respondents to the survey declared at least one of these accessibility categories. That's pretty much identical to what we see in November. And I think really the constancy that we see here is interesting in that it's a powerful reminder of how important folks with accessibility needs are to ridership, and also how much of our and other trip planners user bases they make up. So that's a lesson for us, and I think also our industry of customer-facing apps as well. Now, when we first looked at gender in our COVID survey a year ago, so right after the start of the pandemic, we saw how starkly women were overrepresented among remaining riders, with, of course, a strong correlation to the overrepresentation of women among the ranks of essential workers. So now we see the extent to which that balance has shifted back, especially since November as compared to the April to November period. So here we're looking at the Canadian chart, but it's also worth noting that US respondents were actually at parity between men and women in April 2021. Canada seems to be following that trend along with our initially slower vaccine rollout than happened in the US. And that's also a factor we'll touch upon later again in this webinar. So that's it for top line demographic results. There's lots more in the reports themselves, but let's take a look at intentions to return to public transit. So I'd like to start off this section with very positive news on multiple fronts. Zooming out of the RHB for a second, take a look at Transit's US weekly ridership trends dashboard that Transit built with APTA. So this really shows how far we've come from a year ago. Overall, we're up 62% in the United States in terms of weekly ridership since the same week last May, a year ago. So after hovering just above 30% between August and January, we really see how that US vaccine rollout has bent that weekly ridership curve upwards since then. So getting back to the RHB now, in both the US and Canada, we saw a big increase in the percentage of folks who reported riding either as or more often than before the pandemic. For about half of the respondents in the US or 40% in Canada, to now a clear majority in both countries. Among those who said they were not riding as often, the proportion of US respondents who said they'll wait until after the pandemic to return to public transit, that plummeted from about a quarter to roughly 10% between November and April. So breaking that down a little bit more into work and study commute patterns, the chart you see on the right, our April respondents broadly expected to be riding more in this July than they were when we surveyed them in April. Now, of course, a lot of this is driven by the vaccination campaigns going on. In the US, 61% of riders had reported at least one vaccination dose that they'd already received when we surveyed them during our survey period, which was the last week of April and the first week of May. So meanwhile, at that time, the general population stat for first dose prevalence grew from about 41 to 44%. So we really see the extent to which when we surveyed US transit riders were exceeding the rate of vaccination of the general population. One more note though is that that was also a highly regionalized stat. So 67% of folks reported having been vaccinated at least once in Los Angeles versus 53% in San Antonio, Texas. In Canada, the vaccination campaign, as Canadians know, started slower and later before picking up in the weeks since the April survey. So I think Canada will be an interesting stat to take a look at when we run the RHP again in late July. Okay, so here's the not so great news for this section. In both November and April, we asked respondents to rate their risk of contracting COVID in a variety of settings as compared to public transit. Unfortunately, the proportion of folks who rated public transit as more dangerous than attending, for example, a large indoor gathering increased from 16% in November to 23% in April. Given the abundance of research showing a very low rate of COVID transmission on public transit with mask mandates, I think we all know there's an ongoing perception problem here. Unfortunately, this also seems to be growing. So next up, let's take a look at some of the highlight findings on customer satisfaction in terms of aspects of service provision. So as riders have come back to public transit, we've seen a marked decrease actually in their satisfaction with reliability. And they're responding to a question that's phrased to reflect what we would call more precisely on-time performance. In Canada, we see the improvement on that measure among only a fifth of all agencies. In the US, less than 10% of agencies got a higher score from their riders on reliability than they did in November. So the statements on safety and cleanliness that we asked respondents to rate on a 1 to 5 scale, the statement, "I feel safe while waiting for my bus or train," got the lowest average score among US respondents. Although fair to say for Canada, it wasn't quite so dire. Both countries saw really clear regional variations as well in responses. In the US, riders in colder northern cities and also riders in cities with underground transport systems were more likely to give safety a low rating, that is safety waiting at stops or stations. In Canada, we saw how Quebec agencies received notably higher scores right across the board as compared to agencies like TTC, Calgary Transit, or Winnipeg Transit. In terms of real-time information accuracy, so a fifth of US respondents whom we asked about real-time accuracy for their most recent public transit trip in the last 2 weeks said they were unable to get to their destination in the time they expected. 25% of US respondents and 28% of Canadian respondents said the arrival predictions were inaccurate for their last trip on transit. So now let's take a look at NPS score, or Net Promoter Score. That's a standard metric used really widely in the branding world to measure overall customer opinion. The results that we saw were mixed, but trending positive overall. So let's take a couple examples here at the top and bottom of the chart. OCTA in Orange County, California has made some important improvements in real-time accuracy over the past year with our partner Swiftly. OCTA also saw a rise in NPS, in satisfaction around deployment of COVID safety measures and reliability. ETS in Edmonton, Alberta, implemented a major bus network redesign at the beginning of April, I think, to which we can attribute some of the negative reaction from this survey that started at the end of April. And I think, we all know how change can be hard for riders, and especially hardest at the beginning after a change. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves and hopefully rebounds in July and again in October as we survey opinions in Edmonton then. So on that note of cautious optimism, I'd like to turn it over to David.
Great, thanks, Guy. I get to talk about the fun stuff, the optimistic stuff. So what would make riders return? At our inaugural steering committee in early April, our partners weren't shy in telling us how we could make the survey better. So this focus on how agencies can drive ridership is a set of questions we added on the advice of our partner agencies to make their RHP more useful and actionable for them. Thanks to those partners, we look forward to seeing you again in early July. Specifically, we asked a series of questions here in the form of, I would ride more if my agency ... So here's what we found. Agencies can encourage more ridership by improving the cleanliness of vehicles and distributing masks to everyone who needs one on a vehicle. Almost 50% of respondents strongly agreed that they would ride more if agencies clean the vehicles more and distributed masks. That is, not required masks per se. I think people understand how hard it can be to enforce it, but a gentle encouragement, a carrot rather than a stick. Mask distribution was particularly important to MTA bus riders in New York, as well as to Miami-Dade transit riders. On the safety front, safety on board and at transit stops rates even higher in terms of improving ridership. This continues to match research and recommendations from industry experts. You can read lots of stuff. Google David Zipper for some great articles on this, as well as some others. Places where improved safety would make the largest difference includes, again, MTA, as well as Miami-Dade, in addition to LA Metro and OCTA in Orange County. Accurate trip information also makes a difference. More than 80% of users would ride more often if the information was more accurate. Agencies with respondents who said it would make the biggest difference for them are also the agencies where riders reported the most inaccurate information. So this includes MDOT in Baltimore, as well as the MTA New York City Transit and DDOT in Detroit. And finally, on service provision, not surprisingly, more service means more riders. 75 to 85%, depending on the question of riders, said they would ride more if agencies made bus and train departures more frequent. They sped up service. They created routes that were more convenient to riders' travel needs. The good news is that agencies are bringing service back and using the crisis to reimagine what their service can be. Agencies have been monitoring crowded routes, supplementing them with more vehicles where possible, evaluating microtransit as a replacement for both fixed route service that's underutilized, as well as working to ensure that they can build back better when making plans for the next few years of bus and train service. So let me pull it all together. Overall, the news is good. Riders are returning and planning to return more in July and subsequently. And riders are vaccinated more than the overall population. These are all thanks to the Herculean efforts that agencies have made over the last year plus during the pandemic. This pandemic has changed the way that we perceive our surroundings. It's caused all of us to question something that we took for granted, and that in the industry especially we take for granted, which is the value of being around other people. In all of this uncertainty, information is more important than it's been before. Adding certainty to the experience we really see as key to making this crisis one that leaves public transit in a better place. On the downside, perception issues remain. People still think of the massive advantage that public transit has, that is moving people efficiently through dense corridors, as a drawback. What we're seeing is that this perception can be ameliorated, though, with a combination of communications, but also targeted action. That is, things like mass distribution. As riders continue to come back to work and to school, and thus to transit over the coming months, they know what they want to ride more. They want more service. They want more reliability. They want more safety. They want better bus stops. Focusing on these things, on the return to service levels, from what they expected and heard during the pandemic, and communications on the improvements that happened while they were gone, is another strategy that can help really bring back these riders. And finally, talking about better and more real-time information to answer those key rider questions is important. Their questions are, is my bus going to be there? Will it be crowded? And above all, will I feel unsafe? So the results of this ridership happiness benchmark leave us encouraged for the future. We're looking forward to the next survey in July so that we can understand whether the changes we're starting to see in the spring continue into the summer. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Emily for questions.
Thanks, David. As a reminder, you can use our Q&A function in Zoom to ask questions about the survey, but also anything else you'd love to learn from our team. We're a captive audience. To get us started, I thought I'd address the questions that have come in through the chat already, but I also have prepared questions that should spur some conversation. So I'll start with a question for Kai from Allison. Do we know what people mean by when the pandemic ends? Does this mean once a certain percentage of people are double vaccinated?
Yeah, thanks, Allison. So I mean, in the way we pose the question, I think we're leaving it up to folks to decide what they understand is what the pandemic ends. I think we all kind of have an idea of what that looks like when we're no longer living under this cloud, so to speak. We did also ask them questions about sort of their expectations of future ridership habits as well in separate questions, though.
Cool, thanks. David, this next one's for you from Joseph. Quite useful to have this data. However, if the survey is only of people using the transit app, how do you see folks who have not come back to transit but are traveling again, but by other means?
Yeah, that's a great question, Joe. We cover some of this and some of that within the full report with a sort of longer discussion of what this means and really what this sample that we have is there. You know, we really are only looking at people who are in fact opening the app. Now, we did send a variety of push notifications to people who may not have been active, that is, who may not be riding transit. So it does include some people who aren't necessarily regular riders, you know, but are past users of the app. But there is definitely a sample here. So when we're taking a look at these results, we're taking a look at results from people who are back and riding somewhat for the most part, as opposed to those people who have not yet come back or in the worst case scenario will not come back.
Cool, thanks. And just because I like answering some questions myself, this next one I'm giving to me. Darren asks, how was the safety question framed again? Safety from harassment, safety from crime, or safety from health risks such as COVID, or just safety in general? We, as a result of our steering committee members, came up with a variety of items that included COVID-related questions, but also general safety in various environments. So this included everything from riders' response to "I felt safe while riding," as well as "I felt safe while waiting for my bus or train," all the way to "everyone on board was wearing a mask," "my driver/operator was good at their job." So we really wanted to get at various aspects or facets of the overall safety question. It wasn't just like, do you feel safe while riding transit? We also wanted to find out which of these factors would result in riders riding more often. That was a direct result of our agency steering committee input. So we included things like if agencies improve the cleanliness on board, would that result in you riding more often? All of these factors are defined more specifically in our US and Canadian reports. And you can see all of the different questions that we asked along the way. So yes, it is important to distinguish between different types of the feeling of safety, especially as we try to exit the pandemic. I have a question for Kai. I'm interested in the annual subscription cost for agencies to see the full data set for their respondents. Generally speaking, I think we are exploring this option with every one of our partners. If you email us at partners@transit.app, it'll be the way to get around this. I have another question coming up from Eric Lind. What do you know about the response bias of the survey versus, for instance, robust onboard surveys? This one's for David. Gender breakdown prompted this question, as we often see higher female participation in surveys versus percentage on board.
Yeah, so we've looked at this for past surveys as well, and what we can find is that we are generally representative. We'll post a link in the chat. There's been some published work that shows the representativeness. Obviously, there is some bias. There is bias within surveys that take place on vehicle as well, in terms of who responds and who doesn't. But taking a look at race, at gender, and income in particular, what we found is that we're representative of the population as a whole. The one thing that I will say is that, and we do take this into account, we do tend to slightly have an oversample of younger folks as well. So you do tend to see that, although of course the pandemic has changed that relatively significantly.
Cool. Now I'm going to ask Kai, the survey was offered in English, French, and Spanish. Were there any differences between how riders felt about how their agencies were performing based on the language they speak?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did see a couple of interesting things. For Spanish in the US, we saw that Spanish speakers were quite a bit more likely to recommend their agency to their peers. That's referring back to that NPS score. Spanish speakers would give that question an 8.2 out of 10, their likelihood of recommending, whereas English speakers in the United States gave it a 6.8. Also surprising to us, perhaps, was that Spanish speakers rated their agencies higher on communications and updates than English speakers did, so things like service alerts. They also rated their agencies higher on reliability. Let's see, also that gender disparity we talked about is still fairly stark in this survey among Spanish-speaking respondents, but we're still seeing the same trend in that it's declined since November, but in April, we still saw like a female to male ratio of 1.38. In terms of French, as we are a company located in Quebec, the majority of the Francophones who responded to this survey are from Quebec, and therefore, I think we can mostly attribute differences between English and French-speaking responses in Canada as having to do more with geographic differences than language-based differences. Ultimately, though, both Spanish and French-speaking respondents rated their satisfaction higher than English speakers. The last note I would add is that we were also curious to see if vaccination rates varied at all between linguistic groups and their survey responses. The answer is no, they were very much consistent between all three.
Thanks, Kai. I have a question for David. What impact does car ownership have on things? Did everyone in New York buy a car in the past year and ruin life as we know it?
Yeah, there were some other questions that were, I think, similar within the chat as well, in terms of what do we know about what people are doing and whether people are riders by choice or not riders by choice. So I think a couple points that we want to make right here. So what we found from the surveys last April, which is that right after the lockdowns and the beginning of COVID in 2020, it was really only the most essential workers that were riding public transit. The percentage of car owners that were riding transit, even by the time of November, was more than twice the percentage at the beginning of the pandemic. And so what we found is that now, more than a year after our first survey, the pendulum has settled back towards what appears to be more of an equilibrium. So in April of this year, 74% of users who took the survey did not own a vehicle or have access to one. Also, what we found, though, is that across North America, people who own cars are more likely to report riding less, while people who don't own cars are more likely to report riding with the same frequency as before the pandemic. This pattern hasn't significantly changed between the two prior surveys, but in the last one in April of this year, All riders are reporting more of return to their pre-COVID levels of transit. So 70% of non-car owners are reporting a return, up from 54%, and 53% of car owners up from 38%. This is of people who are taking the survey, knowing the sampling frame that we talked about earlier. The last thing I think to mention here is that the percentage of non-car owners riding is high. Among people who are using public transit, about 30% are riding less frequently than they were according to our results. This is the result of changing travel patterns, and we suspect this number may go down somewhat as people start to commute again. But the measure does still lag for car owners, suggesting that if you own a car, even if you're riding transit occasionally, as you would be if you were taking this survey, you may not be returning to transit on a more regular basis for a while.
That makes sense. Kai, are you able to break out differences in perception between Canadian riders and American ones? And what was the sample size for Canada?
Emily, I might ask for your assistance actually in responding to this one, but
9,000.
Thank you, David. I believe also that our Canadian respondents generally reported higher satisfaction, but not across all measures, absolutely. And some, such as their perception of the accuracy of real-time information, are actually a bit worse than our US respondents.
Yeah.
You can learn more in the individual reports that were shared both in the chat and also in our follow-up email. David, did you have a contribution?
Nope, I was going to say the exact same thing that you did.
Great. I have a question from George. Some transit agencies use the transit app to give the public an idea of how crowded the buses are. As riders come back and capacity limits are lifted, how would the transit app adjust their algorithm? That's a good question, actually, one that we are currently working on with a number of our agency partners. We are currently relaying any information that is provided by the agency and providing agencies feedback on what our Go feature entails. Our Go feature is our step-by-step navigational guide to getting around, where we ask for crowdsourced responses to the question of how crowded a vehicle is. We are giving agencies feedback and also comparing and contrasting those values that are reported by riders to those values that are reported by the agency, and giving them the fodder that they need to take it back to their superiors and make necessary adjustments. But at the moment, we are following the lead of transit agencies on trying to get this information complete. We have time for a couple of more questions before we're going to close it up. I wanted to get a question from I'm going to combine a couple of questions. There is a question about, will there be any effort to pivot and ask employers about their plans to bring employees back to work? I would love to direct this one to David, who might be able to tell us a little bit more about what happened with the types of jobs our respondents have now and how that compares to previous surveys, and kill two birds with one stone.
Yeah, absolutely. So, our focus is really on riders. That's where our strength lies, with the millions of people who use transit across the US, Canada every day. So we're focused on that as from survey results. But what we do know is we ask people about their occupation. And what we found at the beginning of the pandemic was that folks were very much essential workers. There's more data on this within both the Canadian and the US reports, but folks tended to be essential workers, healthcare, food services, etc. And what we've seen is that has stabilized as other professions have come back, although for the most part, white collar jobs are still still underrepresented in the survey prior to what we would have seen prior to the pandemic.
To get back to our Go functionality, Kai, can the Go feature include bus cleanliness, mask availability?
Yeah, so just super quick, Go in Transit is a step-by-step trip planner that gives you real-time location-sensitive updates, and you're also altruistically sharing your vehicle's location anonymously with others. They can see where the vehicle is more accurately on the map. It's a feature that is really appreciated by our power users and also by folks who have visual impairments. So that kind of frequent interaction feature within the app, I think, could provide a really interesting place to gather customer opinion or feedback on the vehicle they're riding more frequently. And it's definitely something we're looking at really closely right now at Transit.
Yeah, and I would just add to that one of the things that we've done over the course of the past couple months is we've rolled out a similar feature with that for crowding, so that when you are using Go and you get onto a vehicle, we ask you, is the vehicle crowded? And we use that for places where they have not yet been able to publish their occupancy data or haven't worked with us to publish historical data. So expanding upon that, we see as something that's really interesting, and things like bus cleanliness and mask availability are definitely on the radar. So thank you for contributing to our product roadmap.
David, this will be the final question. It's from Jack. Do you know if the trends since last year are more about changing opinions among riders who've been around the whole time, or if it's the new riders' opinions skewing the results?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jack. And the short answer is, from everything that we can tell, it's a little bit of both. That is that people are more optimistic than they were, but also that it's not so much that new riders are skewing the results, but they're coming back and that they're feeling differently. And I think that that's a really positive sign. It means that the people who are coming back to transit are coming back not because they have to, not because they have no other option, but because we're turning the tide in terms of the perception, even if there are still those perception issues that are out there. So I see the trends that we're looking at right now as mostly positive, and I'm really excited to see what we do over the summer, to see all the initiatives that transit agencies are making. We, with all the 80 plus partners that we have, we can see how much effort is happening really across both the US and Canada to really prepare for the end of summer and September, especially as hopefully an occasion to celebrate transit and to really reestablish its presence within urban areas. So we're looking forward to what we see at the end of July, and then again in October with the next couple of surveys to track that over time.
Great. And David, we've left you enough time that if you scurry, you can get out for your afternoon stroll.
Thank you.
So I want to remind everyone here where they can get more information is right there on the screen. You can get access to reports. Please contact us for agency-specific information to subscribe to our RHB program. And we really hope you have a happy afternoon.